Bye. At this time, participants' lines are in a listen-only mode. To ask a question during the question and answer session, press star 1 on your touch-tone phone. Today's conference is recorded. If you have any objections, you may disconnect at this time. I will now turn the meeting over to Ms. Candace Maynard. You may begin.
Thank you. Welcome, and thank you for joining us as we kick off the final session in our 4-session pilot of educational seminars designed to provide the content, tools, and resources necessary for public health professionals to address cancer as a public health problem. My name is Candace Maynard, and I'm with NCI's Office of Communications and Education. Today's seminar, Clinical Trials 102, completes an overview of the clinical trials process, including recruitment and accrual challenges and available NCI resources. Please note that we have a variety of different skill levels in our audience today and intend for the material presented to be basic so as to lay the foundation for more advanced concepts to be presented in future sessions. It is my pleasure to introduce our presenter for today, Ms. Rosemary Padberg. Rosemary is a public health advisor in the National Cancer Institute's Office of Communication and Education. Ms. Padberg is a registered nurse by training and received her nursing diploma from St. Luke's Hospital School of Nursing in Kansas City, Missouri, and her Master of Arts degree in Adult and Continuing Education from the University of Missouri, Kansas City. Her career began as a staff nurse in the Children's Unit at the Psychiatric Receiving Hospital in Kansas City. After 20 years as an oncology nurse, Ms. Padberg moved to Washington, D.C. in 1991 and became a clinical trials nurse specialist with the Division of Cancer Prevention at the National Cancer Institute. She has spent the last 20 years working at NCI on bioethical issues relating to clinical trials participation and on promotion of clinical research to the public. And she is currently with NCI's Office of Partnerships and Dissemination Initiatives, again as a public health advisor. Ms. Padberg is a member of the Oncology Nursing Society, the American Association of Cancer Educators, and the Cancer Patient Education Network. I have just a few quick housekeeping items before I turn things over to our presenter. The archive for today's session will be posted to the Education and Training Tools for Health Professional page located on cancer.gov next week. We invite your questions throughout today's presentation. You can pose questions live through the operator by pressing star 1 on your telephone. You will then be placed in the queue for the live Q&A session at the end of today's call. You can also submit questions via the Q&A tab at the top left of your screen. We will get to as many calls and questions as we can in our time today, and we'll alternate between online and live operator. And without further ado, today's presenter, Ms. Rosemary Padberg.
Thank you, Candace. I so look forward to giving this presentation. It's certainly a topic that I've enjoyed learning more about, and I hope I can share some of those learnings with you. Our objectives today is that we're going to really look at the understanding the importance of clinical trials and to really look at some of these barriers. We know there are many, but we're only going to identify a few and really get into more detail on each of those. And really, instead of just barriers, let's start looking at some solutions. There really are some. So let's get started. This is certainly something we all understand, but clinical research is very important to a medical advancement for all of the information that we know as far as prevention, treatment, diagnostic testing has all come through clinical research. And so it's certainly important to have people participating in this. And yet enrollment has long been recognized as very slow, if not a continuous challenge. Some examples of what we've learned about clinical research in the past that we just maybe sometimes forget about is that, penicillin is something that we've looked at in some recent focus group testing of how people really value the importance of pretty much understanding penicillin came to us through a lot of trial and tribulation. Where would we be without the penicillin early in with pneumonia, with that type of breakthroughs? The polio vaccine, HPV vaccines, all of our statins that we take so, frequently. The breast-sparing surgery we got away from the radical mastectomy, and now that we're into the lumpectomy radiation. This is all through the importance of clinical research, and certainly with people participating and willing to participate in it. a brief summary of some of the, where we are with this, just very brief, but certainly cancer in particular is a huge problem that we all are aware of, that some of the stats currently are that 1.5 million new cancer cases were diagnosed in 2010, and that's more than 1,500 a day deaths, 569,000 deaths per year. So the need is to start reducing some of those numbers would be for more effective cancer treatments. And so we think the solution is rapid completion of some clinical trials, and that the reality that we've quoted for a long time in cancer clinical trials is 3 to 5% of eligible patients enroll. But, we really don't know realistically what the top number, we know that 100% of eligible patients will never enroll, but certainly we know it's higher than 3 to 5%. So the impact of this slow progress that we're making is that it hinders the progress of our cancer research. And for those participants that do enroll in a trial that doesn't complete or stops early, is that, they don't get a good impression of clinical research, and not only for themselves, but also for their family and friends that talk to them about clinical trials. So this is just, a bigger problem than just, a patient doesn't complete a trial because the trial closed or couldn't accrue. And then we all know the cost of medical research is huge, both at the institutional research level as well as sites that are trying to conduct a trial, that it's very, very expensive. And so we absolutely have to address poor accrual, and that's what we're trying to do today and in the future. Recent data has really, some of you may have seen this data or heard us talk about it, but up to 68% of NCI trials really fail to accrue sufficient numbers just for analysis. And so, again, hearkening back to the concern that we're wasting money, we're wasting valuable resources. This is really time to fix this problem. And as we've looked at some of the data around in other diseases, that cancer researchers, cancer clinical trial staffs are not alone in this problem, that we all have a lot to learn about what are the challenges that we have and what are solutions to these challenges. So what is the problem? Why is recruitment so low? We all have anecdotal thoughts. We also have informal thoughts. But, what really is it that's driving it? So if we want to just take a closer look, NCI has conducted some recent research with the public and with healthcare providers, looking at several areas that could give us some answers. And we looked at members of some national associations, medical associations, nursing involved in clinical trials. We talked with the GCOP investigators and clinical trial staff. We had interviews with them, and we also went to comprehensive cancer centers and certainly extensive reviews of the literature. And what we were learning is what I'm going to be sharing today of some of these findings, so I hope you'll find this interesting. But go ahead. Some of the key findings, the top of the line, and this is what we'll be addressing, is that there really is a lack of public awareness and education about clinical research, that people generally either are unaware or are aware but are not aware in a correct fashion about what it is. We're going to focus on the very important role of the physician, looking at protocol design and how that can impede enrollment, and how to work with your local community to be more involved, and also the problem of adequate funding. Okay, let's look at this first one, then, this need for public awareness and education. Some of the focus group findings that we had, this was just this last winter, so several months ago, that many participants, or many public, really lacked familiarity with clinical trials, that idea of what is clinical research. And what was interesting is that often they talked about, they said they did understand what, a lot of them said, I do understand what the clinical trial, I understand, what it is, what it does, what it's for, but they were really not correct in what they understood. So there's a lot of misconceptions about what clinical research is and how you participate. certainly there were a lot of negative attitudes about clinical research. What they did know wasn't really all that positive. And what was really interesting is that after we interviewed them and told them a little bit more about clinical research, that they had an increase in understanding and a 30 percentage point increase in how much they understood. And so it really shows us that a little education can make a difference in changing attitudes about participation in clinical research. Of course, we consistently talk about the concerns of placebos, and that certainly was there in a lot of our focus group and survey testing. Placebos and randomization were consistently mentioned, and that's what we expected. But what was interesting for us is that we've heard the term clinical trial can be such a turnoff for folks, that they see that as some kind of a legal, some kind of a judging, some trial, and that it's terms like clinical study or clinical research would be more willing to participate in. But actually in all of our testing, that it really didn't seem to be a negative to the majority of people. On the good side, looking at where participation in clinical research is, this image problem, that CISCRIPT, the Center for Study of Clinical Research Participation, has done a very interesting study in that looking at talking with the public about where they see importance of people participating in helping mankind. What do people think of when they think of people that have helped mankind in a good way, in charitable ways? And so the kind of the ranking order here was, donating an organ is certainly a way to help mankind and to, to serve and be very altruistic kind of a presence. Giving blood is a whole lot easier than giving an organ, and so people thought of that. And, giving money to charity is good. And then down on the list of ways was participating in clinical trial. It's not something that's the top of the mind, and, not only maybe it's not, they don't even think of it as a way to be altruistic and help mankind. So we have a little bit of work on that area. So I kind of class these concerns into some of the known concerns about clinical research, and certainly it's a lot of them are these are the negatives, of course, but those are some of the fears that have been mentioned, and I threw in insurance coverage in here along with some of the other ones we've mentioned, because certainly that's a concern, and who's going to pay for all this work. So often, participants, potential participants in clinical trials really don't know that a clinical trial is an option. They don't see the connection necessarily between medical advances and, in public health and participation in clinical research. And then the media stories. Maybe some of you remember a cover of Time magazine some years ago that had a woman in a patient gown inside of a cage like a rat, and it was a story on clinical trial participation. These kinds of stories are kind of stick in the mind, and I think I've seen that particular slide on so many different talks about bad media, but it's sometimes more subtle than that, of, someone died in clinical research and the investigator didn't do the full due diligence on protections, and just different things of all the many studies that are completed accurately and ethically. There's those few that rise to the occasion that this is the one that the news stories will pick up, and also we aren't seeing this kind of training about clinical research as part of either nursing school or medical school. It's just that sense of it's not part of the normalizing of clinical research. It's part of what we do. What we have seen, though, is that as a corollary is people that do participate in clinical research really find it to be a very satisfactory experience. That this study talks about 97% of these patients or participants that were interviewed felt fully informed. They didn't feel like they were being kept out of the loop of information, that they really knew what was going on and what was the research and what were their risks and benefits. The majority felt treated with dignity and respect, and that's certainly the polar opposite of the concern of feeling like a guinea pig. that they felt like this was, that they were being honored by their participation, and it was a positive experience. And the concern that so often is voiced about feeling like a guinea pig was really rather minor and hardly rose to any higher than the 9%. So our second point here is huge, and it's that focusing on the key role of the physician. And so often that we've talked about physicians as the gatekeeper, and that really has borne out in all the different studies and literature that we've reviewed, that, that 94% of Americans say that their doctor has never talked to them about participating in a trial. And this is not just in cancer trials, but that's for any kind of trial. And as you think back of visiting with, your routine annual physical, or if you go with a problem to your doctor, I've never been asked to be part of a clinical trial. You'd have to bring it up, and I wonder, you probably would feel similarly that it's not the usual thing that somebody is asking you about participating in a trial. And the two reasons that people participate are often for, advancing medicine and altruism, and so that's what they would do it for if the physician would ask them. And yet, only 20% of eligible patients are offered a trial. And so we're saying that, so often that 75% of those offered enroll. And so we've already seen how positive the experience is for those participating. And so it's that whole sense of, the physician asking them and being invited in. The people have said about how they learn about a trial, and again, this reinforces what the earlier data was showing, that mostly they learn, 93%, 73% learn from their physicians, and then it drops way down to other health professionals or on the web, newspaper, family and friends, et cetera, but it's all very single-digit kind of understanding, but primarily it's from the physician. And another, insight here from, another data source is that the physician, especially the oncologist, is the primary trusted source for presenting a trial. And this is not to say that all of us that are not physicians don't play a big role in that, but that the physician is just bringing it up, that if you're going to the doctor's office and that physician says something about you may be eligible for a trial, and even that I'll have my research nurse or, staff person talk to you more about that, that can be very, very important and helpful in beginning the process of thinking about enrollment. And additionally, about clinical research and the role of the individual sites, that ASCO, the American Society of Clinical Oncology, supports this role, and that they really feel that an exemplary attribute of good sites are sites that participate in clinical trials, and that that's a key component of good clinical practice. And so that they really, encourage this and have played a big part in supporting the participation. And Dr. Comas, a physician in one of our cooperative groups, has said this quote, and I've really loved it. It's that the greatest source of a lost opportunity for recruiting patients is the physician's failure to mention the option of a trial to an eligible patient. And so, all the patients that come through that could have been offered a trial and that we just missed the opportunity. And so it's so often that we are the enemy. It's not the barriers to all these other things, but just the importance of just asking. And so I bring all these kind of strategies and ideas into sort of this point of the funnel, and I thought that's a good metaphor for this whole discussion, that these concerns and all the things that are roaming around, that they come down to this certain point of the discussion of a clinical trial between a doctor and a patient. Or just ask. It's pretty simple advice, but that's a solution of figuring this out, of how to make that conversation happen. And I think that as people working in clinical trial research and in different clinics and offices, that you have that chance to just make that conversation happen, whether it's, making sure we know the patient is eligible and that the doctor knows that the information leading up to that conversation is there regarding what are clinical trials, things are in place to try to help that happen. So the third point that we were going to talk about as far as some of our research that came out is the idea of how the design of the protocol can really be influential in enrollment. That we've learned, and certainly we know that the information about the trial is often very difficult to understand, that the most common concern identified has been the complexity of the trial and the difficulty of explaining it to the patient. And I have some breaking news that we learned this week about some really good news about what might be changing, because on Friday, the 22nd of July, the Office of Human Research Protection announced that the Department of Health and Human Services is contemplating ways of enhancing the regulations overseeing research on human subjects, which is called the Common Rule. And they're seeking public input on this issue. And so it seems that the recommended changes might make research a little easier. Several of the ideas that I think pertain to protocol design is looking at consent forms to lay out the studies in a clearer, shorter, more standardized manner. And another one is looking at some different ways with biospecimens and maybe enhancing and improving the way that those can be reviewed and participated in. So the title of this is Advance Notice for the Proposed Rulemaking, but that's essentially we have a 90-day period that we can comment on this. And I'll give you the website now, and maybe, again, I can repeat it later, but it's www.hhs.gov/human subjects. I'll give you that later, too. But I just wanted to tell you this, that I think there's a lot of opportunity here for some changes that really could affect clinical trial accrual in a very positive way. And I've not seen this kind of announcement in a long time, so this is exciting. Back to the protocol design, the idea of multiple tests and procedures that are included in a study that may or may not enhance your opportunity for enrollment. If you're looking at standard of care, as you know, and that there's one bone marrow biopsy in the beginning of the trial and maybe in your standard of care and one at the end at 6 months, but say your protocol is wanting one a month, that's going to make a difference in someone's willingness to enroll. And sometimes, if you have any say in this, in the protocol design, you can ask the investigators, this is going to hurt enrollment, this is going to hurt the applicability of this in the field. Is this something that we have to have, or is that something that's negotiable? Because some of these extra blood draws, extra visits, extra procedures, are nice to have but not necessarily needed, and that we're looking at protocol design to try to change some of the way we maybe make trials easier to enroll in. And again, for just the additional time and effort, it's very, very difficult. Okay. So the fourth topic here is that we looked at and we learned about was reaching out to local physicians in the community, the importance of that and involving them. And some of our research was in-depth interviews with primary care physicians. And we really learned that they were very enthusiastic about NIH-sponsored clinical trials, that they weren't the physicians that are actually enrolling the patients, but they're the physicians that are referring the patients to oncologists that probably would be doing the studies. But having your primary care physician give a good word for the idea that a clinical research study might be an option for you, and that that's something that you might consider if the physician that you're going to be seeing offers it. So it's not necessarily that these primary care physicians know individual trials and know all the different risks and benefits and the numbers and where they could be conducted, but they do know that the importance of clinical research. And it was important, too, that they felt it was NIH-sponsored trials, so that they had a high impression of NIH and that the quality and the credibility of that name, and that imprimatur on a trial said something to them about the quality of the study. again, they don't have much time and interest about talking about clinical trials to patients, and also the importance of community to educate and support clinical trial participation, that advocacy groups in the community, or we've also found that actual participants that have been in the trials are some of our best spokespersons for this, and we have further on in this talk, we talk about some of our Ask Me campaign, but then in that particular regard, that we learned that patients really wanted to talk about their participation, and that wearing these Ask Me pins really gave them a chance to talk about it, and that, that's testimonials, as we all know, can be very powerful. The Institute of Medicine, the IOM, also had workshop last year talking about public engagement in clinical research, and that they really found that the importance of this, that it really, community engagement really aids the translation of research findings into practice. It helps speed up the process, and it makes the whole process more efficient. And so that's additional data, recent data, that talks about the importance of engaging the community and the public in promotion of clinical research. And the fifth point, of course, is money. Research is expensive. It's as we said earlier, between the developing of the protocol and supporting the clinical staff, as well as just your site and all the IRBs and that type of expensive kinds of work can cost money. So we know that per case reimbursement has been low for years, and that we know the pharmaceutical trials certainly offer more to physician offices and practices to conduct trials, and that, of course, the costs are continuing to increase. So time is money, and that's usually the reason that we hear so often of why physicians are not able to go ahead and, they don't have the time to conduct a nice conversation about the importance of enrolling in a trial. So we know that funding issues are a big problem, and, money is tight. So I don't have too many solutions for funding issues, but I do know that in the future that they're looking at ways to find more efficient running of trials so that there could be additional dollars. So in a little bit of a graphic that I like to present is this whole idea of this tracking to recruitment. And on the left end here with basic science and protocol development, all of the scientific investigators and basic scientists are very excited about and they should be, about their research idea, and they want to have a protocol that is developed and that will map out their whole scientific plan of how to conduct this study, because they're excited about, to the far right, the study results. Very important. And so they'll build the protocol, and they'll have study results. And there's this little problem in the middle, and it's called recruitment, that has historically been taken for granted, that you can't make it across from the protocol to study results without patients and participants. So that's historically been a problem. And so with our new thinking, that we're trying to build a nice bridge between the understanding of the protocol development and the study results, that recruitment will have a strong foundation, it will have a straight track, and so that between some of our solutions that we're identifying, that we're able to have a much more coherent system that will help get us from point A to point B. So what are we doing to address some of these challenges? And I've talked about some of those things along the way, to address some of these ongoing efforts in each of these topics that we have discussed today. For instance, last year, in the spring, and we had an NCI sponsored along with ASCO an accrual symposium, and some of the recommendations I'm mentioning here, there were quite a few, and you can find those on the ASCO website. Looking at the symposium recommendations, is that oncologists should be champions of clinical trials. If you have a passionate oncologist at your study or at your site that has a good understanding of a clinical trial, wants to talk to patients and participants about this, wants to talk to the community, wants to talk to referring physicians, that will, of course, make a huge difference in the culture of your office practice around clinical trials. We've seen this in multiple sites where having a champion makes all the difference in the world of success in recruitment. So, I think sometimes champions are born, not made, but I also think champions can come along and be excited about the research and can see some successes, and that kind of success just permeates an office. Certainly the whole team needs to be focused at a center on identifying certainly some kind of recruitment plans and recruitment planning, looking at prospective trial participants and, how they're going to discuss this. There's a whole lot of science around the understanding of describing a trial and identifying participants. And of course, we need more research around this whole topical area of recruitment, that it's not all about the basic science and study results. It's about putting some thoughts on what are the evidence-based practices around clinical trial recruitment. And this is many of you probably have these posters and pins. This is a very popular recruitment item that we have in our NCI armamentarium of recruitment tools, and we've called it the Ask Me campaign. But what they are large posters for your offices or clinics, and also buttons. And it's Ask Me about clinical trials, and it really has been, like I said, not only the staff that wears these, but also participants that really, we were surprised at how popular they were. And these posters can be ordered through the cancer.gov website, looking at the publications, and those can be found there. And they've been very useful, and they're free, and so don't hesitate to go and order some of those. The newest resource in our NCI resource of accrual tools would be AccrualNet. And last April at the NCI ASCO Symposium, AccrualNet was launched. And this is a wonderful site that totally focused on staff looking at helpful things about clinical trial accrual. And it is a unique, comprehensive platform. It's one of a kind. It captures so much knowledge for all stages of a clinical trial's life cycle at one site. And I'm giving you the website here that you can go to this. But that the key components, I think, in a nutshell, would be that it has new information, new resources, publications, up to about 15 a month are put in the different categories of clinical trials along the life cycle of a clinical trial. And so you're able to find evidence-based information, published articles about a clinical trial recruitment, as well as it has an ability that we've summarized these articles, and so that it's not just the abstract of an article, because we've learned from our different interviews that folks in the field trying to conduct clinical trials have no time to read long articles, and that if they could just get the hint of what's the pearl in this article, and so that this website really gives you that opportunity to be able to easily understand what are the high points. And the other piece of this is we call the conversation or the blog, and you're able to talk to one another. We're trying to build a community of practice. So we encourage you to come in if you read an article, if you want to comment on it, or if you want to talk to, get a question answered on that. That's the whole idea, that you're able to post questions, and that, that we're able to provide you with a whole network of other researchers, clinical trial staff across the country that are also participating in this. And both of these sites have been, or components of AccrualNet have been very popular. And AccrualNet has recently won a couple of awards, and we're very proud of it, and it's really taking off. So please do come to this very unique site. The other piece of our, some of our resources are a new online course that it's called Including Clinical Trials in Your Practice. And this was originally, focused on telling the physician of some very high-level ideas on how to participate, why you'd want to bring clinical trials into your practice. but not only for physicians, but we're learning that research staff use it for helping to orient new staff about certain components of the different, and recruitment is certainly part of all this. And so it has a nice overview and some questions and answers with it. And you can also give it as a refresher for folks that might be having some problems in specific areas around regulatory issues or recruitment or enrollment, different things like that. So try that too, and you go through that through the cancer.gov and search for it. And of course, we'd be, missing key parts if we didn't mention just, are you aware of our great clinical trial resources? And I'm going to point your attention to the top two, and that is that talking about clinical treatment trials. That's a big book that's been very popular. It's a little booklet that's often in your waiting rooms. We know it's there because so many of you are ordering it. The other piece of that, right to the right of it, is one on donating tissue, and that's equally been very, very popular, helping very clearly outline why it's important to donate tissue, what it is, what it isn't, and helps allay kind of some of the fears. And so that's been very popular too. But all these resources are very good, and of course they can be found at cancer.gov. So that is all I have, Candace. So I'm going to turn it back to her.
Great. Thank you, Rosemary. The second half of our call today will be devoted to your questions, and we encourage you all to be active participants. As a reminder, please press *1 to be placed in the queue to ask your question. If you would prefer, you can also submit your question online using the Q&A feature at the top of the screen. Marcia, we're now ready for any questions from the phone.
Thank you. Once again, you may press *1 to ask a question. One moment. It takes just a couple moments for them to queue up. And I need to listen to the name. It'll just take another moment. Ms. Mary Fender, your line is open.
Yes, I would like you to repeat the quote about the physician stating that it was a physician's failure to mention clinical trials to eligible patients. Could you please repeat who said that?
Dr. Comas. He is he's been the ECOG principal investigator. I'm looking through my slides, hang on. But his name is Robert Comas. And I believe that was, hang on, maybe, but that was his name. And if you look up his name in PubMed, he has so many articles. But that's, here it is. It's the greatest source of lost opportunity for recruiting patients. And it was 2005. So look at you.
There is another question on the phone. Ms. Sharon Bartell, your line is open.
Yes. Do you have any data after maybe doing all these different initiatives to improve accruals? What has the data shown as far as the percentage of increasing patients in clinical trials?
That's a good question. That's something that is very difficult to track, if not, we never know a cause and effect because there's so many different variables that come into play when you're, it's like say a physician asks, but the patient says no, that a physician's done a great job in presenting the trial and doing everything, the right way, but the patient decided not to enroll. And so you can have everything go correctly, but you don't have higher recruitment. You know what I mean? It's not always a cause and effect. That a lot of things upstream from being involved in the, say, community engagement or information about education, whatever their fear about placebos were, you just don't know what's caused and effect. That you might have a large enrollment, but you might have one physician that's doing a great job and others that aren't. It's It's over time, we just know that certain studies tend to enroll better than others, but we don't know specifically what makes a difference.
Once again, if you'd like to ask a question on the phone, you may press star 1. We have another question populating. It just take another moment or two. Ms. Carolyn Kolaski, your line is open.
My question has to do with minority accrual. I'm an outreach coordinator at a cancer center in Colorado. We have a relatively small minority African-American population, a little bit larger Hispanic population, and we don't necessarily see a whole lot of those patients because there is a city hospital that a lot of them are referred to. But we want to increase our numbers to that in that population. Do you have any particular advice about recruiting African Americans and Hispanics?
Well, the classic advice is to be sure that you have someone in your clinic that represents that population, whether it's, Asian American or African American or Native American, or someone that speaks the language, certainly. That's the classic piece. The other is to certainly have materials that make them feel included in your practice. So if you have, like, say, the Ask Me posters, we have one version that has an African American woman in a lab coat, so that particularly has been frequently offered and ordered by African American sites that are doing clinical research. That whole sense of they don't feel like this is some place for them rather than it's an exclusionary kind of place. Those are the classic types of suggestions that I would give you.
Do you still run into the historical discrimination in clinical trials as a problem, or is that lessening now?
Well, it's interesting that you'd ask that because historically, we always hear, particularly with African American Tuskegee, and that the concerns, rightly so, about the research done at that time. However, recent studies, several have concurred on this, is the sense that African American participants are just as likely and just as willing to enroll in trials as the white participants. It's just that they aren't asked. So often the stereotyping and concerns are in the heads of the investigators and not so much in the heads of the potential participants. And so that the sense of just ask again is pretty important to no matter who it is, So it's that fear of the past concerns are a reason that investigators think they won't participate, so why would I bother? And that's not the case.
Thank you. That's really interesting to hear.
I thought so.
Ms. Elizabeth Lowerson, your line is open.
Hi, yes, I'm a nurse in research, and I visit primary care physicians to inform them about clinical trials, and I get about a 50-50 response of yes, they're interested in it, and the other half, the other 50, is, we think you're speaking to the wrong physicians. You need to be speaking to your oncologist. Is there a buy-in, a golden key, something that I can say to, convince them that if they take 30 seconds and talk to their patients about a clinical trial, just to give them, so that they know that they're available, that they are the key buy-in. And when I go, I do talk about that studies have shown that they will listen to you first and foremost.
Good for you that you're going out and doing that. And I think we sort of on a bell curve, there's always going to be some at one end that always will be willing to support you, and some that are sort of on the fence, and others that will never do it. And it sounds like you've got more of those than the norm. But I would say concentrate on the ones that will. Others that, there's a lot of reasons why they aren't supportive of clinical research, and sometimes it's that they don't want to lose their patients, as we all know. But if they're sending them to a specialist, it's the specialist that's, got to make that usual approach. You're not talking about your primary care physicians participating in the trial, but just promoting the trial, correct?
That's right, yes.
Yeah, so it's, it would be ideal if, some of the posters could be up in their offices and all that, some Ask Me buttons, depending on what their willingness is, but some, I'm afraid, we all know we just never going to win over, but I'm sure glad you have as many as you do. That's sort of not a helpful answer, but I'm afraid that's reality.
Once again, if you'd like to ask a question on the phones, you may press star 1. Currently, no questions are populating on the audio portion.
Okay, so while we're waiting to see if we have any other questions via the telephone, we did receive one question online from the Q&A function, and the question was, how do you think the restructuring of the cooperative groups will affect accrual?
And, that's really not anything we know. I'm sure that their hope is it would improve it and not have any more problems than it already has. I think it has the potential to make it better, but right now it's way too early to know what the restructuring will even look like, and to make any conjectures, I think, is premature. I'm sorry. I wish I knew. I hope it helps.
And once again, if you'd like to ask a question on the phones, press star 1. Currently, no questions are populating.
Okay, well, if there aren't any further questions, then I want to thank you again for your participation in today's seminar. Your feedback is very important to us, and we encourage you to complete our public comment. This feedback form from these pilot sessions will determine whether or not NCI continues to move forward offering additional sessions of Twink Cancer Classroom, and the link to the public comment form will be emailed to you following this call today. This completes our 4-session pilot of educational seminars designed to provide the content, tools, and resources necessary for public health professionals to address cancer as a public health problem. As a reminder, all of these sessions in the Cancer Classroom series are or will be posted to the Education and Training Tools for Health Professional page on cancer.gov. Closed captioning is available for all of the archived sessions. We hope you have enjoyed these sessions and found the content presented over the past 4 seminars useful and informative. Thank you all so very much, and have a great afternoon.
Ms. Maynard, we do have another question. Would you like to take it?
Sure.
Ms. Lowerson, your line is open.
Hi, thank you. Yes, you said you were going to repeat the address for the announcement that you gave about the advance notice for the public to have input. Yes.
Yes. Okay, it's the www.hhs.gov/OHRP/human subjects.
Okay, and can you describe that again for us, what that's about?
Let me see. It's about how OHRP is contemplating ways of enhancing the regulations overseeing research on human subjects. And so it's got quite a few components to it. All of them it's pretty substantial, and I think many of them, and this is purely my opinion, are surprisingly positive. I mean, it's improving. It's lightening up some of the regulations around what we've been living with for so long, and I think, you can read them and then you can make your own impression, and then you are free to comment during this public comment period until September 14th. So there's a frequently asked questions segment in this website, as well as the whole, layers of long language on exactly what it is. But it's called ANPRM. And so it's the whole thing of advance notice for proposed rulemaking. and that's a short term for it. They're going to make some changes, and they're offering the public an opportunity to comment. And so hopefully, depending on the comments, these things would go into regular part of what we call the common rule that's been unchanged for many, many years.
Great. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you so much.
And currently no questions. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you, Marcia. And again, thank you all for joining us in our seminar today. And